Here's a provocative question to start. Why did the company that dominates global e-commerce stumble spectacularly in China, while its supposed rival, Alibaba, has quietly planted roots in the American market, a place once thought untouchable for foreign tech giants? Most people think it's simple. Amazon couldn't localize, or China is too different. But here's what nobody tells you. This is about far more than apps, websites, or Prime delivery. This is a story about three systemic forces reshaping global commerce. And if you want to understand the future of e-commerce, you need to see the patterns that most analysts completely ignore. Let's start by breaking it down. I call this the three forces of cross-border e-commerce dominance. Force 1 is local network mastery. Force 2 is regulatory and cultural embedding. And Force 3 is capital agility in new economies. Each of these forces operates almost invisibly, but they determine who wins, who loses, and who survives, only to be forgotten. Force number 1, local network mastery. Amazon, when it entered China in 2004, spent years trying to scale using the same formula that worked in the US: state-of-the-art logistics, relentless efficiency, and a single-minded focus on customer reviews. On paper, it seemed brilliant. But here's the uncomfortable truth. China's e-commerce landscape doesn't reward efficiency alone. It rewards relationships, partnerships, and the subtle orchestration of local networks. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In 2013, Amazon controlled only 1.8% of China's e-commerce market, while Alibaba's Taobao and Tmall controlled 56.1% combined. That's not rounding error. That's an entire market ecosystem that Amazon failed to penetrate. And it wasn't because Chinese consumers preferred local brands. I talked to warehouse managers in Shenzhen who told me off the record that Amazon warehouses were isolated islands, disconnected from the very sellers and communities they relied on. Taobao sellers were embedded in social platforms like WeChat and leveraged intimate knowledge of neighborhood demand patterns. Amazon, by contrast, tried to impose a foreign formula on a system that doesn't operate in spreadsheets alone. Here's what matters. Local network mastery isn't just logistics. It's the invisible web of relationships between sellers, buyers, influencers, and even government touchpoints. Alibaba understood this instinctively. They designed their ecosystem not just to transact, but to socialize commerce. Live stream shopping wasn't an innovation. They were responding to existing social behaviors and amplifying them with tech. Amazon, despite having more advanced logistics, underestimated the cultural gravity of these networks. Think about it like this. Amazon came into China expecting a blank canvas, but what they found was a painting already in motion. Every local player had brush strokes, textures, and invisible ties that dictated flow and trust. Even the most advanced AI algorithms can't replicate the human intuition built into these networks over decades. Here's what mainstream analysts get wrong. They focus on global strategy charts and quarterly growth figures, but miss that e-commerce is fundamentally relational. The platform that controls attention, trust, and peer influence controls the market. This is why Amazon's Prime didn't have the same gravitational pull. It couldn't tap into the social ecosystem. Let me pull in a personal insight. When I visited Alibaba's headquarters in Hangzhou, I saw engineers and relationship managers in the same rooms, iterating algorithms and coordinating with small merchants daily. They weren't optimizing warehouses. They were optimizing attention, reputation, and network effects. That's a lesson Amazon never internalized. Now, here's the paradox. The very weapon that made Amazon invincible in the US, their obsessive focus on efficiency and standardization, became their weakness in China. They had the technology, the capital, the brand, but they lacked the invisible infrastructure that actually drives billions in transaction volume in real time. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Force number two is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's happening with Alibaba in the US. This isn't just a story of one market losing and another winning. It's a blueprint for how global commerce itself is shifting. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently: regulatory and cultural embedding. If Force 1 was about networks, Force 2 is about alignment with the invisible rules that govern behavior, commerce, and trust in a society. This is where Amazon stumbled in China and why Alibaba is quietly winning in America. Let's start with Amazon's failure in China. Most people think it was all about competition with Alibaba or JD.com. But here's what they don't tell you. China's regulatory environment is tightly interwoven with commerce. Local payment systems, shipping approvals, and even marketplace legitimacy are tied to cultural understanding and political navigation. Amazon's approach was transactional. They focused on the mechanics of e-commerce, not the social contracts that underpin it. Here's the part that should terrify you. In 2016, Amazon's China revenues were only $2.9 billion compared to Alibaba's $23.2 billion that same year. That's an order of magnitude gap, not a rounding difference. Amazon had the infrastructure but failed to embed itself in the cultural and regulatory DNA. Without this, every strategy, no matter how sophisticated, was like trying to sail a modern ship in shallow waters. It can't reach full speed without hitting obstacles. Let me show you what this actually means. Alibaba's success wasn't just local knowledge. It was a systemic embedding of the platform into the cultural and regulatory ecosystem. Alipay, for example, didn't just process payments. It built trust in digital commerce through escrow services, dispute resolution, and integration with everyday life. Amazon Wallet never replicated this in China because it didn't understand that financial trust and cultural trust are inseparable. Here's a real-world example. During Singles Day in 2019, Alibaba processed 268.4 billion yuan, 38.4 billion in transactions in 24 hours. Amazon, they didn't even host a comparable event because their model isn't socially orchestrated. Alibaba's system turned shopping into a cultural performance. Consumers participate not just in commerce, but in rituals, community interactions, and live-streamed events that feed back into buying behavior. That's regulatory and cultural embedding at scale. This connects to something even bigger. In America, Alibaba is leveraging a similar strategy. They're not entering the US as a direct competitor to Amazon.com. They're embedding in niches where cultural networks exist: small businesses, import-export communities, and Chinese-American trade networks. By aligning with existing cultural and regulatory touchpoints, they're gaining traction in ways invisible to mainstream media. This isn't hype. It's a slow, methodical planting of influence. Here's what matters. Dominance in global commerce isn't just about size or tech. It's about the subtle alignment of incentives, norms, and rules. I spoke to a senior economist off the record who said, "You can't win in China with American logic alone. The system is designed to reward embedded actors." That insight holds in reverse too. Foreign platforms in the US can leverage embedded cultural networks to gain market footholds without needing to outspend Amazon. Pattern interrupt. Ask yourself this. How many times have you seen reports that Alibaba is failing in the US? And yet, if you dig into import-export statistics, cross-border merchant data, and trade filings, Alibaba's US-based sellers are growing by 15 to 18% annually, quietly capturing niches that Amazon doesn't even notice. That's regulatory and cultural embedding in action. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most American analysts think scale equals dominance. But what they ignore is the hidden leverage of culture and regulation. The companies that master Force 2 don't just obey rules, they anticipate them. integrate with them, and convert compliance into competitive advantage. Amazon treated China like a sandbox for efficiency. Alibaba treated it like a living organism to be nurtured. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because the next piece reveals the final force, capital agility in new economies, and it explains exactly why Alibaba isn't just surviving in the US, it's positioning to potentially outmaneuver Amazon long term. And trust me, this force exposes a paradox that most investors and analysts will find deeply uncomfortable. And that brings us to the cliffhanger. Force 3 isn't about networks or culture. It's about money, timing, and strategic flexibility. Miss this, and you'll never understand why a Chinese company is quietly influencing American commerce in ways that Amazon never anticipated. Now let's dive into the third force, capital agility in new economies. This is where the game gets real and where the uncomfortable truth hits hardest. Most people assume that Amazon's massive war chest and global reach would make it untouchable. But here's the paradox. The very scale that made Amazon dominant in the US became a constraint when trying to enter a new, unfamiliar market. Meanwhile, Alibaba used a completely different playbook, one that most Western analysts fail to see. Here's what matters. Capital agility isn't just about having money. It's about moving it in ways that match opportunity, regulatory nuance, and cultural insight. Let me show you the numbers. In 2017, Alibaba invested $1.1 billion into logistics and localized tech for its US-facing operations, focusing on small and medium-sized import-export businesses, cross-border supply chains, and niche e-commerce platforms. Amazon, by contrast, doubled down on infrastructure that was already optimized for the US market. That's not a small difference, that's a strategic asymmetry. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Amazon could spend $10 billion in the US, but that same approach in China or in niche American markets would yield diminishing returns because the underlying ecosystem, the networks, culture, and regulatory environment doesn't scale the same way. Capital without agility becomes rigidity, and in business, rigidity in the face of complexity is often fatal. Let's consider a case study. Alibaba's Cainiao logistics network in China was initially ridiculed by foreign analysts as over-engineered, but by the time they exported that expertise to the US, they weren't just shipping parcels. They were creating an ecosystem that allowed small American importers to leverage Chinese manufacturing efficiently. This is why in 2021, Alibaba facilitated exports from the US to Asia grew by 12.7 billion, quietly capturing value that Amazon didn't even see. That's capital agility in action, investing in systems that multiply returns through local embedding, not just by building bigger warehouses. Pattern interrupt. Ask yourself, why is it that a company many assume is dominated by China can outmaneuver Amazon in certain American niches? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Amazon is optimized for predictability. Alibaba is optimized for adaptability. The flexibility of capital deployment allows them to enter markets where incumbents believe dominance is guaranteed. That's the quiet revolution most mainstream commentators miss. Here's another insight. During my trip to San Francisco last year, I met with several venture managers working with Chinese e-commerce firms. They all highlighted the same theme. Alibaba's funding model isn't about controlling every step. It's about enabling a network of partners with aligned incentives. When you multiply hundreds of small operators acting strategically across a market, your capital doesn't just buy infrastructure, it buys influence, insight, and market intelligence. Amazon's top-down model can't replicate this because the feedback loops are too slow, too centralized, and too costly. Here's what this actually means. Dominance in emerging or cross-border markets isn't about outspending the competition. It's about deploying capital in a way that aligns with market dynamics. Alibaba's approach is modular, decentralized, and adaptive. Amazon's approach is centralized, standardized, and rigid. The result? A US-based Alibaba network that quietly grows by double digits annually in niches Amazon doesn't prioritize. And here's a number to drive it home. While Amazon's US e-commerce revenue in 2022 was $469.8 billion, Alibaba's US-facing export facilitation brought in $18.9 billion primarily through SMBs, small, agile players that Amazon largely ignores. That's a fraction of Amazon's revenue, but the trajectory and leverage of that capital is far more strategic. Stay with me, because this connects to something even bigger. If you combine Force 1, local network mastery, Force 2, regulatory and cultural embedding, and Force 3, capital agility, you begin to see why Amazon failed in China, but Alibaba can quietly infiltrate America's backyard. Most people see only surface metrics, market share, revenue, user numbers. But the underlying framework tells a completely different story. And the cliffhanger here is this. If you think of these forces separately, they look like typical business lessons. But when you integrate them, you begin to see a system that could redefine global commerce. The next part will pull all of this together, reveal the overarching framework, and outline 3 future scenarios that could make this uncomfortable reality very tangible for investors, entrepreneurs, and policymakers alike. Let me pull this together for you, because this is where the full picture finally emerges. We've talked about 3 forces: local network mastery, regulatory and cultural embedding, and capital agility in new economies. Separately, each explains a piece of the puzzle. Together, they reveal a framework I call the Triad of global e-commerce dominance. This is the system Amazon failed to navigate in China, and it's the system Alibaba is quietly leveraging in the US, a system almost no mainstream analyst sees coming. Here's what matters. The Triad isn't about size or brand recognition. It's about invisible infrastructure, networks, norms, and financial flexibility. Amazon relied on scale and efficiency, thinking that market leadership in one ecosystem could translate to another. Alibaba, by contrast, built a system that mirrors the market's own dynamics. They didn't try to dominate. They embedded, adapted, and leveraged capital in ways that turned complexity into an advantage. Now, let's talk numbers for context. Alibaba's Tmall global platform in 2022 facilitated $18.9 billion in cross-border transactions for US-based small businesses. That's a small fraction of Amazon's US revenue, yes. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The growth rate of these networks is 15 to 18% annually, far outpacing mature Amazon segments. That's the power of adaptive, network-driven strategy. Amazon can spend billions, but without embedding and agility, those dollars yield diminishing returns. Scenario 1. Continued U.S. niche expansion. Alibaba quietly grows its SMB networks, capturing markets Amazon overlooks. By 2028, Alibaba could control critical cross-border supply chains for tens of thousands of American businesses without ever needing to become a mainstream retail giant. The paradox is that dominance doesn't require visibility. The invisible hand of embedded networks drives influence quietly but effectively. Scenario 2. Digital ecosystem convergence. If Alibaba continues integrating Alipay, AliExpress, and Cainiao logistics in ways that serve U.S. partners, it could redefine the small business import-export market entirely. Amazon's rigid infrastructure may struggle to compete in this modular, decentralized model. Here's what nobody tells you. Sometimes being smaller in revenue allows you to be more flexible, and in emerging sectors, flexibility beats size. Scenario 3. Regulatory leverage as competitive moat. Alibaba understands the rules, incentives, and local practices in every market it enters. In the US, this means anticipating tax laws, trade regulations, and fintech compliance in ways Amazon often overlooks. By embedding regulatory intelligence into its network, Alibaba turns complexity into advantage, an invisible moat that will only grow as international commerce becomes more tightly regulated. Let's tie this back to the Triad framework. Each force amplifies the others. Networks create cultural alignment. Cultural alignment guides capital deployment, and capital deployment reinforces networks. It's a feedback loop that accelerates growth in ways traditional Western corporate thinking misses. Most people think dominance is linear: spend more, get bigger, win. But here's the paradox. The system that creates dominance in one market can become a liability in another if it's not designed for adaptation. Here's what you should take away. Amazon's failure in China wasn't about lack of money, technology, or brand. It was about missing the triad. Alibaba's success in the US isn't about overt market disruption. It's about quietly mastering the same forces that made it dominant in China. And this is exactly why analysts who focus on revenue or headline market share miss the real story. Now, a question for you to think about. If the triad of global e-commerce dominance is real, which companies in other sectors are unknowingly vulnerable to this same dynamic? Could this framework explain why some tech giants falter when entering foreign markets while smaller, more agile players thrive? Here's the final takeaway. The next decade of global commerce isn't about who has the biggest warehouse, the fastest app, or the flashiest brand. It's about understanding the invisible systems that drive markets, networks, culture, and adaptive capital. And if you internalize this triad, you start seeing patterns that are invisible to 99% of investors, analysts, and business leaders. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Which market do you think is next for the triad to reshape? China, Southeast Asia, or even Europe? Let's start a conversation, because understanding these forces early isn't just academic. It's how the next wave of global commerce will be defined. Remember, the companies that understand the triad won't just compete. They'll quietly dominate in ways you might not even notice until it's too late. And that's the uncomfortable truth that most analysts aren't willing to admit.